Greetings everyone, and welcome to the second edition of Ask Shane Anything on its new day, on Thursdays. Now I'll say this, we didn't get as many new questions as we usually do before we film this episode, but I think that's because you guys were a lot of times showing up on Thursday to ask questions for the show on Friday. So if you guys can just shift that to Wednesday, that would be awesome. I mean, the good news is we still have plenty of questions for today's show and some good ones. And a reminder that this show does happen because a lot of people are pledging at $7 or more per month at patreon.com/SIFTD. That is the Ask Shane tier there. Now, everyone gets to watch the archive. Everyone does get to ask questions, but if I'm choosing between two, I tend to pick the question coming from someone who's pledging at that higher tier. I think you guys can understand that. To our YouTube crew, what's up? Thanks for your support watching this show. It's been cool to watch the views of this show go up a little bit week by week. Appreciate it very much. We have a great episode once again. Let's get to the questions. First up, our question comes from Bachby. Your discussion with Matt about Sega releasing Yakuza games like Clockwork because they repurpose assets got me thinking. Why do you think more companies are not doing the same thing? The fear is that all the games end up looking the same, but do you think there is a happy medium that can be reached? 5+ years is too long to create a video game. Bachby, I agree 1,000,000% with you. 5 years, way too long to make a video game. I think just now the industry is really starting to see the strain of not releasing enough products over time. So I hear you, and I'm all about trying to find solutions to get games out more quickly. Now, here's the thing. I work in video production, I've worked in television, and I've been doing this for 20-some years. And there's a thing in video production called file footage. That's where you go and shoot footage, and then you keep it, and you use it over and over and over again. And if you shoot it well enough and you do it right, that footage is evergreen. You can use it into perpetuity. So for an example, every year at E3, I would go shoot B-roll of the show floor. I just walk around for a couple hours and just shoot everything. And I have used footage from E3 2016, 2017, 2018, etc. Still, I use it. Other things that I've shot that I use over and over, any shots from Los Angeles, down at the beach, the city skyline, all that stuff is file footage that you can use over and over again. However, that doesn't necessarily work in video games. Now, you may think it does because of this particular case, which is the Yakuza games from Sega. If you think about it, do the Yakuza games look all that different from one entry to another? Do you ever see an entry in that franchise that jumps drastically as far as visual fidelity is concerned? Not very often. You go back and look at those games from 8 years ago, they look pretty much the same as they do now, and that's the problem. So if you create assets for a video game back in 2014, can you still be using those assets in 2024? You can't, because technology has moved on. Now again, Sega, Yakuza, a different story. They're okay releasing games that mostly look the same over time because it has like this niche, very dedicated fan base that is going to snatch up the games pretty much no matter what. So those games are an anomaly, and I think that happens a lot. You see something happen, and you're like, oh, can that apply to everything else? And in this case, it absolutely does not. Would you want to play the next God of War that has assets from the 2018 game when you're probably going to play the next God of War on PlayStation 6? Probably not. I just don't think that you can extrapolate that concept out to most other properties. Now, again, other properties that are like Yakuza, where it has a built-in fan base that's just going to buy it no matter what, you can probably get away with being lazy. And this is kind of being lazy. I mean, I think it's a glass half full, half empty thing, where you're looking at it as like half full. I'm looking at it as half empty because I want to see games look better over time. I don't want to see games look the same. Now, let's say you have a city in a video game, and you know that several sequels are going to be set in that same city over time. Could you reuse the assets then? Yes, but you'd still have to go back and touch them up as technology has moved on. So you could still have like the structures there, but you could just retexture them or relight the environment. So there still is some value in building something and then iterating on it, but it doesn't work as well in video games as it does in other media. All right, next up we have a question from SJD Swanland. You and I really love our horror films, but the genre is much more complex than most realize. I typically dislike slashers, going more for folk horror, but I still love the Terrifier films. I was wondering if you could explain, out of the sort of horror you seek, what films have been your favorites and why, but also share some of your favorite atypical horror films that do something entirely different. Okay, SJD Swanland, if I really answered this question, it could take up this whole episode of Ask Shane Anything and then some, so I'm going to try to truncate this as best as possible. I'm also probably stupidly going to use some clips from some of the movies that I'm talking about. It may send up copyright strikes, but at this point, the views for Ask Shane Anything on YouTube aren't that big that I'm not willing to sacrifice some ad revenue for a good show. So we'll see how that goes. But anyway, the first thing I would say is for people who don't know already, and SJD Swanland obviously does know already, I am a huge horror movie fan. I was a little gorehead. When I was a kid, I had a subscription to Fangoria. I had a gigantic poster on the wall, and I'm talking at like 8 or 9 years old, of the scene in Videodrome where the guy explodes apart. I remember I put that on my wall, and my dad was like, "What are you doing?" I wanted to be a practical effects artist for a big chunk of, well, not a big chunk of my life, but for like a 4 or 5 year span. I'm like, I want to do that. I want to be the next Savini. So I was way into it, and so were my friends. And in our little town where we grew up, we had video rental stores back then, like every town did. But the weird thing for that town was that the Rite Aid there rented movies. And if we tried to go to like the main video stores, they wouldn't let us rent horror movies because we were like children. But if we went to that Rite Aid store, they would rent us anything. And the crazy thing about it was Rite Aid had all these hyper gory, unrated horror movies that the other video stores didn't carry. And it was a boon for me and my friends. We would go there every day and rent a new horror movie. And some of them were abysmal, and some of them were absolutely incredible that still stick with me today. So I've been in this thing for a long time. Now, I will say this, probably 10 or 15 years ago, I was probably a horror movie expert. Like, you could put me on a TV show, or put me in a documentary, or rely on me for commentary for an article you're writing. I have fallen off, in all honesty, with horror over the last, like, decade or so. And I think a lot of it was that I just saturated myself with it so much in the earlier parts of my life. To be honest with you, SJD Swanland, I feel like I've seen it all. Now, you mentioned Terrifier. Is that really new? I'll say this, it does combine the slasher film with kind of the over-the-top exploitive gore film. So maybe that's where it's innovative, and I have watched the Terrifier films. Terrifier 3 obviously is coming up here real soon. That's probably why you're bringing this up. But otherwise, like, I've just kind of fallen off with horror. I don't watch a lot of it anymore. To be honest, I don't watch a lot of movies or TV shows anymore. So, once upon a time, I was an expert. I don't know that I would call myself that anymore. However, I know a metric ton about horror movies. For me, personally, like, I started, like everybody else, watching Friday the 13th and Halloween and all those slasher films that you're talking about. But after a while, I think I got to like Friday the 13th Part 3, and I was like, this seems to be the line that they're drawing here. They're not going to go any further because they want to make sure that they get in a ton of theaters. So if the movie's too hardcore, you're not going to get in all the theaters in suburbia where a film goes from making 20 million to like 500 million or whatever. That's just not going to happen if your film goes too far. So I realized that at a young age that the best horror movies were the ones that weren't going to theaters. And that's when me and my friends really started digging in. So some of the early movies that kind of piqued my interest, I think like a lot of people, Texas Chainsaw Massacre was one of the first ones for me, where it was just like, it wasn't just a slasher film. There was something more sinister and psychological to the horror. Another early favorite for me that really turned me on to horror movies was the very first Evil Dead. Before they made it funny in the second one and then Army of Darkness, I still like the original Evil Dead way more than all the rest of the franchise when it actually took itself seriously now. It's kind of returned to that with the recent films. But the first Evil Dead, the first time I saw it, shattered me. And I know you watch it now and you're like, oh, look, that looks like milk. But like, when you're like 7, that white blood scares the living crap out of you. Or just the gore in general. The scenes where like the white blood would go into people's mouths. It was just hardcore. And again, I realize if you watch it now, some of it looks a little corny or whatever. When you're a kid in like the 80s, that is terrifying. And it terrified me. But it showed me that there was this whole other side to horror films that I didn't know anything about. Like, I never knew The Evil Dead was even in movie theaters. Like, I thought it was like straight to VHS or whatever. So anyway, those were two of the early movies that kind of got me going. And from there, I just took off. And that's where me and my friends started diving deep into that catalog at Rite Aid. And we started finding crazy movies there. One of the movies that we found there was a movie from like the 60s called 2000 Maniacs. And it's this movie about this redneck town that these unsuspecting idiots drive into and they're just murdered. And there's one scene in there where they draw and quarter somebody, where they tie ropes to their arms and legs, and then the horses run all directions, and it just rips their limbs off. And we were just like, oh my God. It was from the 60s. Look it up. You can probably watch it for free on YouTube. I think they made an updated version of it in the early aughts or something that I've never even watched. But anyway, we discovered that. And they started discovering Cannibal Holocaust, which is way overrated, by the way. It's like this movie that they made, and like the local governments thought that they were really killing people on the set. So there's all this controversy around it. The movie actually isn't that big a deal, but it was a big deal as a story for us as kids. We're like, oh my gosh, people thought this was real. They really killed people on set. All that stuff makes a difference when you're very young and impressionable. So we started watching that, and then there's another movie called Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things. It's not a gory movie. It is just creepy AF. Still to this day. Like the acting performances, everything about it is just creepy. So all these films, I Spit on Your Grave, the original I Spit on Your Grave, the original The Hills Have Eyes. And then over time, that just naturally segued for me personally into the over-the-top shock horror era that we're kind of still in, that I would throw Terrifier into as well. But there was just, for a good 10 or 15 years, just a plethora of crazy over-the-top horror films that, in all honesty, was like my final hurrah. Like, once I watched this set of movies, I was like, I feel like I've seen it all. For a lot of you probably haven't watched these, but if you've ever seen a more commercial take on it, which was Human Centipede, then that's kind of what I'm talking about. Stuff that is just like, you probably in the 70s would have been rated X, and now it's just like unrated here in current day and age. Some of the films I would mention there, just read off a list here so I don't forget anything. There's Martyrs, a Serbian film, Hereditary, Inside, the August Underground trilogy, Frontiers, and then I got into the whole Japanese horror thing and Miike. Miike, obviously, his big film is Audition, which is just an amazing horror film, but also not really just a straight-up horror film. And they had another really crazy film called Imprint. I do not recommend that you watch that. In fact, I have a friend who worked on that film. When we go to Japan, or when we used to go to Japan for Tokyo Game Show, we would have fixers, people who would meet us and kind of take us around. If we need translators, they'd translate and stuff like that. Well, one of our fixers there worked on Imprint, and there's a scene in the movie, and a big part of the movie is about this girl who lives with this family in an Asian village, and their family is known to perform abortions, and people come to them to get abortions. And there's one scene in that where there are just dozens, and what they would do is they'd abort the babies and put them in the stream. And there's one scene in that where you just see dozens of babies just floating down the stream. It's insane. Well, the crazy part was, like, they were downstream and they had a net to catch some of the babies, or catch all the babies, and the net wasn't catching them all, and some of them went way downstream, and the authorities thought that they were really dead babies, and it turned into this huge thing. Anyway, I only recommend that for those with really strong wills and guts of iron, because that movie, it is a horror movie, but it's just really, really disturbing. And so I started getting into that whole scene, and it just goes on, and then eventually I got to the point where I was just like, I don't know what else there is to see. I've seen Sodom, and that's another one that's on all the disturbing horror movie lists. It's not great. It's basically the people eating crap for like 2 hours, literally. And stuff like a Serbian film, not really a horror film. It's just scene after scene of just disturbing crap. And I think that's where I got to the point where I was like, I don't feel like there's a lot of art in these films anymore, and that's where I kind of fell off. So that's where I'm at with horror movies. I don't know if I answered your question specifically, but I think in a roundabout way, I kind of did. I think I explained what movies I like and why I like them and kind of how I've changed over time. If you guys know of any great horror movies or horror franchises that I haven't mentioned here, and there are, obviously I've watched tons more that I didn't mention here, but if you know any off the top of your head that you think I should watch, after you just listen to that answer, hit me up and maybe you can get me back into it. Next up, we have a question from Greg or G. GTA Online is a huge cash cow. What do you believe is the key to its success? Can it be replicated by another company? If so, why do you think no one has tried? Well, I think a lot of developers and publishers have tried, and I think the problem is that most of them have just failed. So I think there's been a lot of projects in the background that publishers have worked on, developers have worked on to try to replicate that success. They got to the point where they're like, this isn't going to work, and they just bailed on it, and it never sees the light of day. For a long time, there were tons of single-player games that would have multiplayer modes tacked onto them that sometimes made sense, usually they didn't make sense, but it was still a thing for a really long time. And I feel like GTA Online was kind of the next logical step from that. Now, I don't want to take anything away from Rockstar. What it's done with GTA Online is genius, but A big reason why it's successful is because the game has sold like 170 million copies. So if you only, let's just look at the math there. Even if you only get 2 or 3% penetration from that installed base of the game, that's gigantic. You have like 4 or 5 million people playing GTA Online, and that is more than enough to keep any game as a service not just surviving, but thriving. So the thing here is that Grand Theft Auto 5 is an anomaly. It is like the best-selling game of all time. Comparing it to other games and other IP, to me, is just a fool's errand. So that's where I would start. And then you got to look at Rockstar itself. So you may say, well, maybe it was Rockstar's genius that made it happen. Well, Rockstar tried the same thing with Red Dead Redemption 2, with Red Dead Online. And it was not accepted at all. It had a really rough launch. But here's the thing. GTA Online also had a really rough launch. If you remember, back when it first came out, people were getting robbed at ATM stores. And it was a story for like the first month the game was out. You had to go and put your money into an ATM after you earned the money. And people would just camp out by the ATMs, wait for you to show up, and they'd just kill you and take your money. Well, then eventually they put in the option to be able to upload it through your cell phone in the game, and that kind of solved the problem. People stuck around long enough for Rockstar to fix that because it was Grand Theft Auto 5. Red Dead Redemption 2, kind of the same thing was happening. Like the first week that Red Dead Online launched, it was literally just people just killing each other. Like you'd spawn and there'd be 8 dudes on a horse just shooting you and you die. It was no fun, it was messed up, and unfortunately, well, depending on your perspective anyway, Rockstar never fixed it. It did eventually, but it didn't fix it fast enough, and it just fell by the wayside, and now no one cares about Red Dead Online. So it isn't even a Rockstar thing. It is totally a Grand Theft Auto 5 thing. So I think everybody else has a much tougher road to toe with turning something into a game as a service. It really is just the mass amounts of people that are playing Grand Theft Auto 5 that are also sustaining Grand Theft Auto Online. Okay, our last question for today's show comes from Kevin. What is the longest stretch of hours you have played a game for? Oh boy, Kevin, I have to tell you, I really had to think about this one because there have been some marathons. Most recently, my longest was probably Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I think I played that game like 26 hours in like 2 days, something like that. That's probably the most recent one. But after thinking about it, going back through my entire career and my entire life, I think the game that I played the most in a single sitting was Banjo-Tooie. Now, some context for you here. I had basically just started at GameSpot. Like, I was a new hire, and when I was hired there, I was a magazine editor, meaning that I was putting all Ziff Davis's magazines online as websites. So I was working with EGM and OPM, and I think Tips and Tricks magazine was a Ziff Davis mag back then, just to get their stuff into this crappy web form on GameSpot and put their magazines up as a website. And that was supposed to be like a full-time job, and I would get the job done in like a day and a half. And so they were like, oh, we need to find stuff for Shane to do. And they knew that I had been running a website for a long time. They knew that I had reviewed tons of games. And so eventually they started giving me games, but not big games, really crappy games. And so Banjo-Tooie was one of the first big games that GameSpot gave me to cover, and I didn't want to screw it up. And so here's the other part about it. Back then, in the N64 era, Nintendo's first party games, it was different. They would show up at the office with this N64 with a big steel cage around it, with the cartridge, which was a ROM, which is an N64 cartridge that's like really long, into the N64 with a steel cage around it so you couldn't take the cart out and then, pirate it or steal it or whatever. And for a long time, they would come and watch you play. You'd sit there in your office with someone from Nintendo sitting next to you while you played the game. It was bizarre. And they were finally starting to loosen those reins around Banjo-Tooie. And they came in, and for the first day, they sat there and watched me play the game. And then, the second day, they came in the morning and then disappeared. It didn't sit there. And so I got to play just by myself in the office the second day. And then the third day, they come in and they're like, look, we trust you guys. You can't get the card out of the thing anyway. We're coming back next week to pick it up. Do whatever you want. And so that next day, I took it home. And I literally think I played for 36 hours straight. That game was gigantic. And I was on a crazy deadline. And I literally didn't sleep and played all day. And then most of the next day before I finally just collapsed. And I'll say this too, as I got more tired, the game became more difficult, because that game in particular, it's like, hey, you got this thing here, and now you need to take it like 5 miles inside the game to this other little spot you've completely forgotten about and use it to unlock this new area. And as I got, as time wore on and I hadn't had any sleep, it got harder to play the game. So that was my longest play session. The other detail to that was we had just moved to San Francisco, and like my wife's sister came to visit us, and I never saw her. I think I had dinner with her like one time, and that's when she realized, oh wow, like Shane is into this stuff. So anyway, that to me I think is my biggest play session, but man, there's been so many throughout the years. Okay, that's it for this week's edition of Ask Shane Anything. Again, don't forget, this show is going to be every Thursday going forward, because we're doing Pactor Factor Live every Friday now. And so start getting those questions in a little earlier than you're used to. Tuesday or Wednesday now would be great. Or maybe when you are watching Game Face, you can go over to the thread and ask a couple questions. We appreciate everybody who asks questions, and you guys do a really good job of it. I just said on Game Face that you guys shock me pretty much every week with how great the questions are for this show, so thank you very much. Again, this show is a reward for people who are pledging at $7 or more per month at patreon.com/sifted. Everybody gets to ask questions, everybody gets to watch the archive, but if you pledge at that amount, you have a much higher chance of getting your question into the show. So thanks again for all your support. Whether you're watching this as a patron or whether you're watching it on YouTube, I love all of you. We'll see you next week.